invited to speak by the MENA Undergraduate Association. And having devoted many years to institutional development of Middle East and North African studies at the faculty level and at the graduate level, I'm very much looking forward to the continued development of the undergraduate, the minor, the majors, all the different ways that we can begin to integrate more Middle Eastern studies, more interdisciplinary studies for more undergraduates at the University of Arizona. So thank you very much for your efforts on this front. So my talk today is part of a project that I hope to be bringing to completion and publication very soon in the form of an ethnography that documents the full scope of this major movement and migration phenomenon that we could call the Syrian refugee crisis, that from a more Eurocentric perspective has been called the European migration crisis. And the nature of my project is following members of an extended family, 5 branches of an extended family, as they make their way from their home in war-torn Damascus to Germany as their final destination. And so this part that I will present here today is focused on a recent development for one of the branches of the family, namely they're becoming trapped along the route at the Greek-Macedonian border. And those of you who follow the news on this front might be familiar with the worsening and dire situation that has happened on the Greek-Macedonian border, in particular, as the process that started 2 years ago of people moving westwards to Germany has now, as of February 2016, become blocked. So it gives us a chance to look at one small aspect of the humanitarian crisis through one family's eyes, and also to explore some other aspects, namely what happens. And this is a question that's near and dear to all of us as community members in a border community that has its own issues with walls and militarized borders. And then another issue of what happens to the ideals and the vision and the values that the European Union is built on when people are beginning to be warehoused in terrible conditions in camps along the way. So this is my the family that I'm following, and we have been in constant communication since I took these pictures in mid-February on a trip to Turkey, where I went to visit them as they were preparing to embark upon the very dangerous trek across the Aegean, up overland through the Balkan corridor, and ultimately to rejoin family members who had preceded them in Germany. And this is the way things are happening now. It's often the case because of the great expense of making this trip, more money than many of us could muster on a dime, several $1,000s at least necessary to risk one's life in these overcrowded, perilous boats with an average of 6 to 12 deaths a day for most of the period of the Aegean crossing. Families in general would send a father or a brother out first, hoping then to reach Germany and use Germany's most liberal of all European family reunification policies to bring the rest of the family without having to have them make the perilous journey also. This system began to break down in the winter of 2015, and the family reunification process that had attracted many people on the notion that it was a 3 to 4 month waiting period resulted in the rest of the families trying to make the journey themselves. So here we are at the starting point of the journey in Yalova in Turkey, not quite a suburb, but off of Istanbul, across the Sea of Marmara. And the family's meeting here. And in the few days that I spent with them, preparing for their journey, it was all about how to pack for a perilous journey in which your things might be thrown overboard. In fact, were very likely to be thrown overboard from an inflated raft by the smugglers to whom you had paid large amounts of money. And so it was all about how to keep your most precious possessions, your cash, your identity papers, your cell phone, dry, and what else you could take along the way. So we spent an entire day or two wrapping things in plastic and then retaping them with adhesive tape and then slitting open waistbands of jeans and sewing small packets of money and cards and photocopies into the seams of people's clothing so that they would be harder to steal and harder to lose and less likely to be damaged by the water, which is almost certainly a part of this journey. Here is a brief overview, and I won't belabor this. I've done this lecture a few times. A brief overview in one infographic of the Syrian migration crisis, which becomes actually the European migration crisis in that about now maybe 40 to 50% of the people arriving in Europe to seek asylum are Syrian. They are joined by Iraqis, Afghans, people from South Asia, people from Africa, and even people from other non-war-torn Middle Eastern countries like Iran and Lebanon, who are piggybacking on the opening of these routes. I'll be happy to talk more about the mechanics of the routes later. Just suffice it to say that very brief overview. The route started, the European migration started 2013 to 2014 on the Central European route from Libya up to Italy, proved extremely dangerous, with hundreds of people drowning at the time as they were packed by smugglers onto unseaworthy cargo ships, decommissioned cargo ships, and then left to drift towards the Italian coast. By 2015, people realized that the journey from Turkey across the Aegean was a much shorter journey that allowed you to maintain cell phone contact with your loved ones and, importantly, with activists and the Coast Guard. And we saw, over the course of 2015, develop a new route that actually eclipsed and outgrew the initial central Mediterranean route. The very dangerous part of the journey was the overland route, and I've spoken about this numerous times. We can talk about that part as well. That was the hard part. That was the part that people started paying $3,000, $2,000. Eventually, when the market grew sparse, as little as $750 by the winter of 2015 to get across the Aegean. And then the rest was supposed to be comparatively easy. An overland route through Macedonia, Serbia, initially through Hungary. When Hungary began to build a wall and closed off its border, the route shifted to Croatia, Slovenia, into Austria, and for most of the migrants to their ultimate destination in Germany. And you can see that long line there reflects people's German goal. Yeah, question?
Maybe I didn't hear right, but does the whole family go on this journey, or is it just the male that does the journey, or?
Well, it's a market, so depending on how the family makes its decisions and how much money they have to spend. Very often, if you only have enough money to send one person, it would be an older son or a father. If you have the resources to send the whole family at a time, then you'll send the whole family at a time. There are many, many children, and for the first time in February of 2016, as we'll talk about, more women and children, for the first time in the whole migration, were making the trip than young men, or men generally. So it's really a decision that everyone makes on their own. Okay? Again, the Eurocentric perspective has it that this is the European refugee crisis, or the European migrant crisis, preferring a word that allows us to think of these people as possibly motivated by their own self-interest, their own economic advancement, rather than fleeing from intolerable situations. But you can see from this somewhat outdated map that, of course, the vast majority of the refugees are still in the neighboring Arab countries. and only probably about a fourth of those have made their way successfully to Europe. The numbers are still huge. On top of 7 to 8 million internally displaced people within Syria, there are probably 5 million people outside of Syria, 4 million of them in the neighboring Arab countries, with about somewhere under 1 million, but again joined by the flows of other travelers from Afghanistan, Iraq, Africa, and South Asia, probably about 1 million applying for asylum in Europe. Okay? Again, there is good reason to think of this as a European crisis, because whereas the much poorer, much weaker states of Lebanon and Jordan, for example, have not done a great job of integrating the Syrian refugees. In fact, life for the refugees in Syria and Jordan, in Lebanon, sorry, and Jordan was quite hellish. But they have been integrated badly into the economies, into state structures for 2 or 3 years. The difference with Europe is how fragile Europe is. And what I have up here is a map of some of the different agreements that structure that European fragility. And I'll just mention a couple of them. The countries in blue are EU countries under the Schengen Agreement, which guarantees free passage across borders within these European countries. Schengen was a great idea, and it sits at the heart of European plans for a European future. And it also has been a great boost to the economic power of Europe. You don't have to stop, check, change currencies, exert tolls and taxes on things. So Schengen is a very nice idea, but it was completely undermined and challenged as different EU countries and non-EU countries have begun to opt out. Back in November or October of 2015, you can see Hungary took the first steps. Hungary, it's very sketchy here. So Greece is an EU and Schengen member, separated from the others by non-EU countries, by some EU countries that are not Schengen countries, that also enjoy very bad reputations in terms of their reception for migrants from the Islamic world. So basically, making the Aegean trip from Turkey to one of the eastern Greek islands was extremely perilous, but doable. Take a ferry to Athens or to Kavala, and then you move through these countries. When the Aegean route first started, Macedonia, when it was new to this game, started entrapping and catching migrants as they made their way on foot through Macedonia and returning them back to Greece. It took them about a month to realize that, in fact, if you return people backwards, if you push people backwards along the route which they are going to follow, they will try again and again and again and again until they make it through. So by summer of 2015, the Macedonians and the Serbians realized that, in fact, you don't catch people and deport them backwards. You catch them and deport them forwards. And you don't have to deal with them over and over again, and you're only dealing with a fraction of the issue. So from the summer through to just about now, that was the basic European practice. Send them on to Germany. Hungary put a stop to that by putting up a wall. And as I argued elsewhere, what happened, the flow went westwards to Croatia and Slovenia. But this is all Migration 101. Now, again, the overland crossing from Turkey into both Greece and Bulgaria is blocked by walls. And the latest wall is the wall, the fence at the Macedonian border. So suddenly, Greece, which as you all know, just before the migration crisis became the big story was the Greek financial crisis. Greece was on the brink of complete economic collapse, subject to crippling austerity measures itself, and in a great deal of political turmoil. So now, as of February, the buck has stopped in Greece, and this is now a Greek crisis. Here is a shot, with slightly different climate. It looks a little bit like the U.S.-Mexico border fence. There's a fence there. It's a frontier. Okay? The frontier is patrolled on the Macedonian side, not only by Macedonian guards, but also by guards from, auxiliaries, we could say, from other Balkan countries or from other European countries. And we'll talk about that in a second. A decision was made in February that the buck would stop in Macedonia, itself an impoverished country, but one that other European countries were willing to put resources into so that the migrants would not reach and apply for asylum further north. Okay? So here again is a little map showing Macedonia here in black. And of course, one of the things that is probably going to happen is the opening up of other new routes, because of course these routes are managed by smugglers who run very lucrative and elaborate ecosystems of crime. So if you can't go through Macedonia, that opens up another extremely dangerous water route from Greece to Italy, another one from Turkey through the Black Sea into the very hostile countries of Bulgaria and Romania, and probably a resurgence of the Central European route. The smugglers on the Central European route are already reporting increases in traffic as the Aegean route is beginning to shut down. So, our family made it, and that's another story, across the Aegean to the island of Lesbos, and then to one of the increasingly squalid camps on the island of Lesbos, then by ferry, again overcrowded and poor condition, to the port of Kavala, and then to the border where they expected, like everyone who had gone before them, like about 1 million people who had gone before them, to simply spend the night on the Greek-Macedonian border, have their papers stamped, and proceed. Well, that didn't happen. And this is an overview of the growing camp at Idomeni from a few weeks ago. It grew larger than this, and probably now has shrunk down to about this size again, of 10 to 11,000 people here. The big white tents belong to the International Organization of Migration, Médecins Sans Frontières, and others. And these are the railroad tracks along which people have trudged to get to this point, to the border crossing, and then people have camped out in the fields around, and everyone is anxious to get away from the main squalor in the center and to find a little patch out on the periphery. Just today, the Greek farmer who owns this land took out his tractor and began plowing the fields in frustration because he wanted to grow fodder for his cows and had to be restrained from doing so by some of the assembled authorities who are managing the camp. Okay? As it became clear, and we'll talk about this in a second, that the Macedonian border was not going to be open. It had not only been fortified by the reinforcements from other Eastern European countries, and a firm resolve on the part of the Macedonian government. Everyone is now, has been for over a month, stuck at the Idomeni camp. I know you probably can't read the Greek alphabet up there, but if you look, it has become, its size wavers between 10 to about 14,000 people. So it is by far bigger than any of the others, including the squalid camps in Lesbos, which are about 4,000 or 5,000 people. There's another 2,000 camped right outside Idomeni at the place that we know as the gas station of Polycastro, which itself has become a de facto refugee camp. And now the Greek authorities, with the encouragement of Europe and the promise of European reinforcements, is trying to redistribute about 52,000 refugees throughout these different locations, away from some of the more squalid de facto camps to hastily erected, slightly more hygienic and humane camps in some of the non-obvious parts of Greece. And this is what's currently going on. As I mentioned now, by the winter of 2015-2016, the price to smuggle oneself from Turkey to Greece has fallen dramatically. The people who had $3,000 to spend went in the first wave, and they lowered the price to $2,000. Now the going price is somewhere between $750 to $500 or $450. Indication that, in fact, this is a business. If we didn't know from other sources, we do know it now. It's a business, and the business is to keep those boats full of people for as long as possible. The boats are overcrowded, dangerous, etc., etc. The recruiters who get people, who put butts in boats, probably make $50 a head for their recruits, and the rest of the money is funneled up into gangs, and perhaps even with a collusion through bribery or other means into the state. But with these lower prices, with the realization that the normal family reunification process promised to people or early in the process is now gone, now for the first time we see that most of the people crossing are in fact women and children. And that seems to be the case at Idomeni as well. These are the conditions that people are living in, and these are some of the pictures that my friends have sent to me. It is absolutely squalid, and in fact the pictures that they take themselves show the full nastiness of it actually more clearly than some of the published photos that you will already see. You see for 14,000 people the row of latrines, which women particularly avoid at all costs because they are so nasty. You can understand the impulse to find a place out in the fields to do your business rather than stand in line and jostle for position at these latrines with thousands of strangers. Garbage collection and the camps with tents provided by volunteer associations arrayed right behind them. Throughout the entire month of February, 3/4 of the time it was cold and it was raining. And people are lucky to live in these little tents, but clearly they are soaked through. People are literally living in mud. And in some of the pictures you can see human rights don't apply here. You can see some of the attempts of people to dry their clothing out. For those of you who are theoretically inclined, the whole abstract notion of the camp as a particularly important site going into the 21st century, whether we're talking about concentration camps, refugee camps, or prison camps, the whole notion of a space where people are warehoused outside of political culture is a really interesting and productive concept, and some of the work that we're doing explores what happens when thousands of people are pushed beyond the pale, as it were, are not admitted into political civil society and exist out there. Some of the most important theorists of the camp have said it's all about reducing people to bare life, to being bodies stripped of political or civil rights or responsibilities. What's fascinating about looking at these camps, this camp in particular, and I think this applies to lots of other camps, is how, yes, it's all about bare life. It's all about where do you actually go to the bathroom, how do you keep your body dry and free of disease, but it's also incredibly bureaucratic. And so in the time that these people are not waiting in lines for their next cheese sandwich, and the lines take about 4 hours for each meal. So you stand in line to receive your handout, which is very humiliating. You eat your handout, and then you go stand in line for the next meal, because this is what you are reduced to. There are small vendors who will sell things. There are taxi drivers who will take you into town. You're not imprisoned here, but it's a very demeaning experience, and it is overlaid by multiple layers of bureaucracy. Your papers have to be right. People's second preoccupation is having the right papers, not getting caught with the wrong papers that might disqualify them, as they thought for most of February, from further movement onward. There's a great deal of anxiety about bureaucracy. Little businesses have sprung up. Some of you might have heard of the Barber from Aleppo, who ran out of money in Idomeni and has made some money by giving people haircuts and shaves as they desperately try to keep clean. The camp is visited by celebrities like the Chinese performance artist Ai Weiwei, here patronizing the Barber of Idomeni, and Ai Weiwei attempted to touch people's conscience by importing a piano and having some of the refugees play concertos in the mud under a tarp to sort of say, is this Europe? This doesn't feel like Europe. Disease became rampant, but the refugees were incensed that the journalists, and there's a pack of journalists around the place, bringing this story to the outside world, but they were incensed when the journalists started wearing rubber gloves as a protection against the inhabitants of the camp who are frustrated and despairing, and on top of that, insulted to be treated as if they themselves were vermin or disease. Okay? This guy got a lot of attention. One of the reasons why I was able to do this work and why the refugees are not completely out of the picture is that there is a Wi-Fi connection. And a Greek gentleman set up an intense Wi-Fi connection that will allow about 900 people to connect at a time at his own expense. This was not a government project, it wasn't an NGO, it was a local Greek citizen who took it upon himself, understanding how critical cell phones were and how critical those links with home were to the deteriorating emotional and mental condition of the people. He set up a Wi-Fi station so people have fairly good communications in and out. And it contrasts starkly with the basic picture, which is one of mud up to your ankles. And this is a guy taking his son, who understandably became sick. Everyone is sick in this camp. It's true they're not vermin and you don't need to protect yourself wearing rubber gloves, but clearly people are coughing and sneezing and cold and feverish, and Médecins Sans Frontières do have a medical clinic there. They have a sign up in front that says, we can't help you with your legal issues, but we can offer you some rudimentary free medical care. So the impression that you get is this field of mud and shit and cold drizzle that rarely lets up, with some of the expectations that you might have of medical care, a free sandwich, the ability to catch a cab for 50 euros to go into town to buy some food at the grocery store. But remember, these people were not planning to be here for a month. They had spent their big wad of cash to get across the Aegean, and most of them had budgeted maybe $100, $200, $300 for taxis to get them to Germany. So they're here. They don't have money to go shopping in Idomeni village, and here they sit. More pictures, again, the main white camps of the larger NGOs and the smaller camps handed out to people by volunteers, which they consider themselves lucky to have. But you can see they desperately try and put pieces of garbage bag or tarp over the top of the tent because the tents are not waterproof for a month. Okay? And then other pictures as people try to get away from the main congregation down in this little valley, which quickly filled up with water, etc. And here another sense of just how bad and awful the weather has been. So, we talked a little bit about fences, we talked a little bit about camps, and the last part of my subtitle was the challenges to humanitarianism. Europe has not distinguished itself in this process, and what the people in the camp, it was actually very devastating to the people in the camp to anticipate the outcome of two major European meetings. The first in early March, where the basics of some kind of resolution to this process were to be hammered out. So the refugees with their internet connections were waiting. They thought surely as soon as Turkey and the EU leaders meet, they will come to some kind of resolution. The border will be open. That's why we're going to sit here and wait for another couple of days. Well, they met, and the refugees were horrified to find out that rather than negotiating some kind of solution for the 52,000 people who are in Greece right now and don't want to stay, especially the 14,000 at the Macedonian border, the plan was one much more tailored to big power needs, namely that the refugees would be sent back to Turkey once they had come, and a one-for-one deal would be enacted in which all these illegal immigrants would be sent back to Turkey. For every one documented and sent back, one refugee would be taken out of a proper Turkish refugee camp and sent to asylum in Europe. So a one-for-one trade in which the worst thing that you could have going for you was to already have arrived in Greece. Later they found out that prescription would not apply to them, but clearly anyone who arrived after March 20th would be sent back to Turkey. And the people on the ground here are saying, well, what about us? We're already here. We are happy in the knowledge that we are not going to be sent back in contravention of the Geneva Convention and all kinds of asylum law, the mass deportation of asylum seekers without individual fair hearings, as claimed by Amnesty International and many others who think about this, to be illegal. You have to hear a person's claim for asylum, and you don't hear it in groups, and you don't deport people without hearing it. And yet this was the deal that was agreed upon by the Turks and the EU representatives in Geneva in early March. Okay? Again, people in the camps communicate with the outside world, constantly trying to prick the conscience of the outside world, saying we are not only are we not pawns, we're also not merchandise to be traded back and forth in some kind of fair trade agreement. Okay? And there was another date that people were eagerly anticipating as they sat shivering and coughing in their tents, namely the date at which the Europeans might or might not ratify this deal, sometime around March 17th, 18th. They said, okay, so they made the deal, but surely the Europeans will not agree to this deal. When they meet in Brussels, it will be turned down. But instead, the deal was heartily agreed to, and here you have Donald Tusk, the liberal Polish EU president, warmly embracing the Turkish foreign minister over this agreement. Yeah, question.
For the refugees, do they, I guess, do any have actually died from this, or if there has, do you know the percentage?
No one, to my knowledge, has yet died. The casualties that I know about are the following. A 13-year-old boy was electrocuted while playing on the train lines, and he fell off and touched a live wire, was electrocuted in critical condition, and taken by ambulance to hospital. After this deal, when people still could not believe that nothing was going to happen, 2 people have attempted self-immolation and were taken to hospital, but did not die. There have been other events and incidents, and one type of incident is particularly disturbing. As the Europeans and the Turks negotiate over the status of these refugees, Syrians are deemed to have real claims to asylum. Others, not so much. So, a deep rift has begun to emerge between Syrians and non-Syrians, because Syrians are seen to be getting, in this system, preferential treatment. So Afghans, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis have protested against the 2-tiered system, and there have been incidents, fights, knife fights, and in fact, was just informed last night that these fights are spreading back to Athens and back to some of the other camps as discontented Afghans are raiding some of the Syrian parts of the camps and vice versa. And last night in Piraeus, where people have been sent in the aftermath of this, there was quite a melee. People are really worried about the resurgence of violence over several days. Yes?
Don't you think that someone should negotiate with the European Union instead of the Turkish government because, they are Turkish, they have nothing related with the IDD?
Yeah, well, clearly, these people feel betrayed by all parties, certainly by all state parties. And in the course of this, the state of Cyprus came up and said, hey, wait a minute, we're not going to roll over for this Turkish EU deal in which the Turks, this is a Turkish proposal, that yeah, sure, we'll take these refugees off your hands, but we want to be fast-tracked into the EU, we want EU visa-free travel as of the summer of 2016. Something that has been part of Turkish foreign policy goals for a long time. It was nakedly self-interested on the part of the AKP government in Turkey. And only little Cyprus raised their hand and said, we object, actually. We have some outstanding issues with Turkey, and we object to the fast-tracking. And this is all the while as Turkey is cracking down on journalists, basically perpetrating a war in its southeastern provinces. And the fact that the chronic EU refusal to consider fast-track membership for Turkey based on human rights violations is now in total contradiction. The whole thing is in quite a state of hypocrisy in this regard. So people on the ground feel very frustrated. It's interesting, yes, Sepho.
I was just going to say a few also important historical factors to consider. Going back even before the start of the Syrian war, 2009 was a really important year when that was sort of the first time when the movements across the Mediterranean moved eastward as a result of the arrangements between Italy and Libya and other Western Mediterranean countries. And then it was for a while, the land border was in Evros was the main crossing point. But when Greece in 2011 built a land border in Evros, that's when it pushed people into the Aegean. So it's important to remember also that, like what happens here too, when you block off the safest routes, people take the more dangerous routes. So
people are not stopping. Even after March 20th, people are still coming by the hundreds, not by the thousands, but by the hundreds. And they are piling up in Lesbos and Chios and the other islands. So it is a chronic problem. I never heard of the Visegrad Four before this year, but it's mostly a sporting association. This is from the bicycling map of the Visegrad Four. It's a cultural association of Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. And it's very interesting that it's the Visegrad organization, reflecting some of those conservative Christian identity, Eastern European, anti-Western European views that has mobilized and is actually helping to reinforce the Macedonian border. So it's very interesting that the discourse coming out of the conservative parts of Eastern Europe, while also being about Christian identity and invaded by Islam, et cetera, it's also highly critical of the bumbling incompetence of the EU and is beginning to pose its own solutions. Hence, Czech contracts to reinforce the Macedonian border, Czech border guards and canine units, et cetera, coming along. And very interesting, just as Turkey is a major player who has lots of leverage over the dynamics of the smuggling business, Russia also has no long-term interest in making this any easier for the European Union. In the last campaign that ended last month, Russian bombardment began to kill more Syrian civilians than Syrian government bombardment, and you had an increased 50,000 refugees from northern Syria trying to make their way. So Russia also, by intensifying or de-intensifying their bombardment, also by back-channel negotiations with some of the less EU-minded parts of the Eastern European political scene, also has an interest in this. Okay? By the time of Nowruz, this was Nowruz celebrations in Greece, the Kurdish New Year on March 21st or 22nd. Unusual to see the large bonfires of Nowruz in the Greek agricultural fields, but things have gotten really bad at this point. Well-meaning, or perhaps not so well-meaning, volunteers advertised to the refugees that if they gathered in force and forced their way across the Macedonian border, there's nothing that could be done, and these flyers in Arabic were handed out, and a march of over 1,000, probably 1,500 desperate people simply plowed their way through the Macedonian border, separating themselves from the little safety of the camp, so they didn't have food, they didn't have water, they couldn't take their tents, and they marched out across the border, crossing a river. 3 people were drowned in the course of this march in the river, a pregnant Afghan woman and 2 of her family members who were among the first to attempt this water crossing, drowned. By the afternoon of that day, they had strung a rope crossing across. 1,500 people made it across and started marching northward into Macedonia, only to be rounded up by the Macedonian police. Many of them were being beaten, and returned to the camp in Greece. That's how things are going. In the meantime, the Greek Minister of Health had to resign over a typical European matter. He made the mistake of calling Macedonia Macedonia instead of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. This was so scandalous, within Greece that he was forced to resign. So people are dying, and Europeans are politicking as they do. The family that we started out with spent over 3 weeks in a tent in the camp there, going through this routine. I talked to them every day. We communicated daily on the preferred method of WhatsApp. They were sick. Every time I called them, they were coughing, sick. You could hear people coughing in the background. It was just the sound of infectious disease. After the second European meeting, most of the people didn't have the opportunities that my set of family members did, but they ran out of hope after 3 weeks in these conditions, and they were so sick they could hardly move. They got on buses. When it was clear that the Macedonian border wasn't going to open, buses started to appear to take people and redistribute them to older camps back in Athens and other places, and they were happy to get on the bus and sleep for 9 hours that it took them to get back to Athens. They were unable to get out of bed for the next 3 days. They were so sick with chills and fever, and it took them about a week to recover. And after spending, $60 a night in a hotel in Athens that they didn't have, they moved to one of these camps. It's inside, it's safe. There are probably 5,000 people in these interior camps in Athens, and they are happy not to be cold and wet and muddy and dirty all the time. But here they sit, and they are now awaiting some kind of resolution to this situation. Every day they say, have you forgotten about us? Have we simply been forgotten? And no, there are volunteers, there are NGOs, EU lawyers come through every day. There are limited time Skype sessions for a few hours a day, but no real solution. The Greek government would like help from the EU, but the only help that has been forthcoming is from Turkey. And the Turkish government has been happy to send hundreds of bureaucrats to begin processing people's return to Turkey. So old-timers on the island of Lesbos are horrified to find that rather than the European Union coming to their aid with manpower, it's Turkey who has fully mobilized to gain every advantage from this situation. And so I end with this picture that made the rounds on Facebook and via WhatsApp, reflecting the frustration that, can we not think of a common humanity rather than piling our women and children into these perilous rafts? How would the leaders of Europe congregating in Brussels feel on these rafts? So thank you very much.